Welcome everybody to Frantic Learning. At one point we called the show Effective Education. That name is no longer with us. We are now Frantic Learning. My name is Joseph and I have been in web media for 10 years. My job on a day like today is to help professionals like you understand and use web media to the best of your ability, as well as the best of its ability. And I'm here with Pavel Koryagin. Pavel has a lifetime's worth of experience as a programmer and CTO, and his world-renowned ability to self-learn is the inspiration to put this content together. Pavel, as always, thank you for starting this project up. Thank you for including me. If you have anything on the mind, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we've got a lot of work to do today, so I'm ready to jump in if you are.
Hi everyone. Hi Joseph. Thanks. Let's start.
All right, so picking up where we left off, we have done 2 episodes so far on learning techniques, and I think I think today will be the 3rd and final episode, at least for now, but there's probably no shortage of learning techniques out there. So Pavel, let's go right into the first skill that we wanted to talk about today. We have 5, and if I had to guess, there's probably going to be some correlation, and you talk about one skill and it might bring up other supplementary skills. So the first one that I wanted to talk to you about is Markdown. Now, a quick recap: skills are categorized as hard skills, soft skills, habits, and meta skills. You can check out our previous content to get the full explanation of all of those, but Markdown is a hard skill. So Pavel, what is marking down and how important is this?
Yeah, a little bit more about the place about of this in the bigger picture of our talk. So we talked about the self-education and the trajectory of becoming a web developer and how to make it more efficient. Setting the hard skills aside because there are lots of information on the internet, we are now about to fill the gaps and talk about the skills that should also be added for you to be a good professional and even sometimes to easier find your first job. Markdown is the simplest of all the skills we're going to talk about to understand. Markdown is mostly about the student embracing that, yes, this expertise exists and I should learn it, but to actually learn it, it is sufficient to read a single article because it is pretty simple. So the most important thing here is to understand that you need it and to understand its place. What is Markdown? Markdown is, to say it simply, a convention how to put punctuation into your plain text. So you could have a plain text in plain English, and you could use that text to document something, or even to simply leave a comment in the online communication. If this content is complex enough, you will want to add there bold, italic, headers, etc. So Markdown is designed to be readable in both cases, if it is rendered where bold really looks bold, or where when you see the plain text the same way as you typed it from your keyboard without any shortcuts. So bold will look as marked with double stars on the both ends of the word that you want to make bold, and a header would be marked as a hashtag sign, one or many, depending on the level. So that's enough to know about Markdown in general. It is easier to see the examples and virtually instantly remember how it works, but it is an important thing to add to your track before you finding a real job, because you will need this thing to share your knowledge with your colleagues and to use GitHub that we will mention down the road.
You know, initially when I was going through the skills that we were going to talk about, because Markdown was one of the hard skills, and on the list that we were looking at, there were a lot of soft skills, a lot of meta skills. I didn't see too many hard skills, so that's why it was a priority for me. I'm kind of surprised that a hard skill is actually not as extensive to talk about as perhaps soft skills. I think that might be because in the soft skill realm, there's more subjectivity and there's more flexibility in its use, whereas a hard skill is pretty much this is what you need to do, and there's not that much wiggle room.
A soft skill here in connection to Markdown would be how to write understandable, how to write texts that are easy to understand what you plan to communicate, how to understand what you are going to communicate. But I hope we will talk about that separately, not today, because that's exactly the complex thing and there are lots of words. And Markdown is a hard skill, right? If we see it literally, but when you focus on acquiring some profession, it is a hard skill that goes aside, that improves, leverages your proficiency. You can be a developer without knowing Markdown. Of course, if your team uses communication in this form, you will learn it ad hoc. But if you're prepared, this opens your the ability to see things a little bit different. So it is introduced by me as a meta skill because it modulates your actual skills in coding. The ability to create text in this format, to work with this format. But strictly speaking, it is a hard skill because it is a particular set of knowledge, very short set of knowledge that you have to.
Just reflecting on it from my experience in gaming, especially in the earlier years when there wasn't a lot of voice acting, a lot of the information conveyed to the player was done through text. And so, just to make sure that the player understood the most important in context, text would be in red or blue versus the rest of it would be in white. And so this is actually something that I think most of us experience on a day-to-day basis. And I think even in the most pedestrian uses, it's if somebody decides to write in all caps to emphasize a point. You take two sentences, one in caps, one not in caps, you get two very different impressions. So the last question that I want to ask about this, and then we're moving on, is there a tangible use case for it outside of programming, other professions, other industries that prioritize using Markdown?
Yes, we could mention that scientists like it, and not literally scientists, but all the people who experiment with personal knowledge management. Some software, for example, Obsidian, are based on this format, and this format simplifies for you typing text, typing random text, actually. It is easier, often easier than doing that in visual editors like Microsoft Word. So even the visual editors like Notion supports some shortcuts that resemble Markdown. For example, you could type two opening square brackets to let Notion understand that you're about to add a link to the same database, to the same Notion database. Although Notion doesn't show you the Markdown syntax, it recognizes the elements of Markdown because it is very convenient. But we've spent already much more attention for this topic than it deserves because the idea was to add it to the trajectory for the beginner developer. It is really easy. It should be there. But let's move on to something new, more complex.
I 100% agree. So, our second skill that we're talking about today is code formatting. This is characterized as a soft skill and a habit. So, why is code formatting necessary? And I did a little bit of digging on my own just so that I kind of understood some of this going in. And I did provide at least one link for each of the skills that we're talking about today that I'll be sure to include in the show notes. So ChatGPT, my sounding board / therapist, says the four following reasons: readability, consistency, debugging, and documentation. So Pavel, let's take it from there.
Yeah, that's a generic words that ChatGPT told you, and the real knowledge in some particular cases, particular problems, and examples if we are successful enough to recall some. So, code formatting. It's the thing that sometimes even could be seen in movies, like in Silicon Valley was a breakup between two geeks on this topic. Let's start. Why code formatting exists as a separate topic? That's because the code is created not only for the machine, and we need to mention that in many programming languages, many modern programming languages, you could write the same thing in different ways. And in particular, you could add different amount of spaces, and this will mean nothing for the machine. But the code is written not only for the machine, because even when you read your own code in 6 months, you're a different person. This code looks to you as something created by others. And so you communicate using this code not only with the machine, but with other people, other developers, and including yourself from the future. And here's the thing. If your code is miscommunicating something, then you create troubles for those who try to understand it and make decisions based on their understanding. In the life not related to coding, there is a trick that many people think it is not lying of not telling some part of the truth. In my opinion, if you are not telling the part of the truth that is significant for the understanding, that is, it is the same as telling lies. But you could do similar things unintentionally. If something is obvious to you and you don't say it to the person who are listening to you, then you are telling lies without the intention of doing it. And when we return to code formatting, there are things that have different impact on understanding, and those one things are only uncomfortable for your colleagues who see the aesthetics, but the other things could be really misleading. So the most important thing for the developers to master is to do proper indentation. What does it mean? If you start a block, a logical block, in most cases you do that in if construction, conditionals, in the loops, and in creating subroutines or functions. If you miss a line, the beginning and the end of the block and its contents, the other developers have the wrong impression of where the condition ends, and thus they read the code in a different way than the machine will read. So the human reads one version of the code, uh, making intuitive leaps between different lines because our capacity is not as big as the capacity of a machine. So we cannot read every letter there and every operator. We skip some parts of the code that feels intuitive for us. And if the formatting is misleading, then you read a different thing that the machine will read in the same place. And what I've seen in my practice that for some people, it is difficult to align the different blocks properly, while for the most people it is intuitive. Uh, the beginner developers could start writing code randomly, but once you told them that, hey, it is possible to do this, they start seeing this, they align the visual line of where the vertical line goes and where we have the indentation of something nested. But I saw people to whom this took a special effort. I think it's possible to train that even if you have some sort of dyslexia or this feature of brain that makes you see the characters, these symbols that we used to write in a little bit different ways than most people do. That could be trained to intuition, and you could focus on the most important things first and the less important things last. And here we go to the question: if the problem is that machine sees the code one way and the developer sees it another way, plus the programming languages are formal, then can the machine format the code for us? And when I used to teach people to do the proper alignment, these tools were not available. But today, Retier is with us for many years. And I see it mandatory on many projects. And I want to tell the beginner developer my advice on this. When you only learn how to code in your learning projects, please avoid using Prettier as a tool that formats the code for you. Use Prettier, or even better, in JavaScript, I recommend the tool ESLint with Airbnb code formatting style. Use it in the mode when it shows you the mistakes, shows you where you do not fit into the format, and configure that in your code editor like VS Code, because it could underline the problem part and show you pop-up hints. And that's the opposite. When you work in a real team, that very likely this formatting will be enabled automatically for you. And when you already trained to see those things, you could relax and let the machine do the work. You could set up it in the same VS Code, but not to highlight the mistakes for you, but to apply the formatting automatically every time you save a file. And this difference is important because you are forming your own skills. By practicing this mechanical formatting, proper formatting, you train yourself also to notice the details, which is a very important meta skills, and you probably need a separate lesson on this. But why would you chase for some separate training if you could do that as you go, as you do the natural practice? That's the first skill, to notice the details. And the second skill is to notice what other people decided to identify as a beautiful code. Because beneath the beauty, there are meanings, and sometimes people just want to see similar things to look similar. That's one story. That's our natural feel of beauty. But in other cases, these conventions are based on proper communication, on more clear communication. And if you notice that, you better notice similar things in other aspects of your life, of your work, and everything.
Can you distill what would be the single most important part, or the most important takeaway from this? And then after that, what would you say is the part that people maybe don't need to worry so much about, where there is a little bit more room for tolerance?
There are two dimensions. First dimension is the element of code formatting. The most important element is the line indentation, because it is misleading. The other aspects of code formatting could be tolerated. And another dimension is to how to practice this. Here's my recommendation: is do not you delegate the formatting to the machine while you learn. Let the machine teach you, consume the feedback from the machine, and the more immediate the feedback, the better for you learn. And as opposite, when you work in the real team, then set up to let the machine format it for you and focus on the things that are more important for your work.
What would happen if you're working on multiple projects with multiple code conventions? What might be a
Mhm.
struggle or problem that you would run into in that situation?
Right, yeah, that's an interesting case because that's happening, and that lets you understand more of how to be a friendly worker. Because I often see that people come to a project and promoting some specific code style that feels to them as perfect, and they want everyone to follow the same code. But in reality, the best code style is a code style that the whole team follows. So if you already have some existing code base and your team has already started following some particular rules, then the best option for you is to understand them and to mimic them, to follow the same rules. If you have some automated code formatting on your project, that will happen automatically. You just shouldn't be too crabby about that, right? And if you work on several projects at once, that's about the acceptance. So try to accept the idea that it is most important to be on the same wavelength with other people you work with, and this automatically means that it is normal to switch between different styles. Accept that that you can do that, and that the different styles won't be confusing for you.
So you would find that there are multiple styles within each programming language. That's just part I want to make sure I understood.
Yes, especially in JavaScript, somehow they made semicolons optional. JavaScript is derived from C, and it belongs to C family language. So people prefer to use that semicolon because it resembles how the code looks in other languages of this family. But as long as this symbol is optional, there is another group of people who think, okay, let's don't use it. Because in Python and Ruby, they don't have semicolons, so why would we use it in JavaScript? And that's probably the most curious example, but as it was in Silicon Valley, the discussion was about using tabs or spaces, or it could be different spaces, or it could be do you put a space before an opening parenthesis or after it? I think the only exception is Python. Yes, the language itself allows you this variability, but they have one official guide of what is a cool Python code is. So all the developers have the same guide and more or less they synchronize. With other languages, that's per team. Every team choose their own coding standard. And again, I promote Airbnb for JavaScript. You could see that it is the most popular because statistics is available in its packages.
One thing that we're moving on to the next question, but as just a passing observation, it would be interesting to observe how the different communities form based off how they work together on understanding the formatting of each programming language. So that's something that I'm taking away from this. All right, so with that, we're moving on to number 3, Git flows. This is characterized as a hard skill. So I've heard the term GitHub 100 times, even as a non-developer, but I don't know the first thing about what a Git is. So I would love to understand that first before we talk about what Git flows are.
There is no surprise that we are still talking about the communications in the team because we are filling that gap. And Git flows, it is not completely a hard skill because Git flow assumes the particular set of conventions. And in that sense, knowing that particular convention is a hard skill. But most of teams use their own approach in forming this flow, so it is much more important to know why this exists, what is the logic beneath it, and this is more of a meta skill because it is something fluent. It shapes how you think about things, It is not the particular set of rules. So I hope for many people who has already started learning programming, that's obvious what is Git and how it works. But if you're only a beginner, let's recap. Git is the most popular product solving the task that is called version control. If you work with a text, for example, you will tend to create copies of files to preserve your work when you decided that you've created a big block of code that is wrong and you want to improve it. But you are not sure that your improvement will be better than what was before, and you would like to easily revert to any version of it. And that's exactly what we do. A couple of decades ago, most of the developers do, although the systems, version control systems were already available, but only big corporations use them. We just created copies of our files and we called them when we wanted to see what's changed. The new generation of easy to adapt version control systems, including Git, allowed us to always see what's changed and to freeze those changes with a short description of what exactly changed there. Plus, it allowed us to switch between different versions and work on one version and then on another, having the branches, having the fork in our road, and progressing in two different roads, switching between them, and then merging the results together. In most of cases, merging automatically. And it was my first merge in Git felt as a magic because everything worked. Also, I tested two different parts separately and they affected some shared code and still. And GitHub is the most popular hosting where you could have a remote copy of your Git. So several people from your team will work with the same copy on the GitHub website. There are alternatives like GitLab, Bitbucket, and you could set up something similar by yourself. But GitHub is the most successful of them. So when we work as a team on this, because the meta skill is denoted as Git flow, not as Git and GitHub. So let's talk about the meta skill and where it is. Git flow is a convention of how you name branches for the team to clearly communicate what is that and how to deal with this. Basic Git flow introduces us such things as a feature, new feature, bug fix, where we fix a bug, main or trunk or developer branch, the branch where the most recent version of our product exists, production and release branches, etc. And as long as we have teams with different culture, with different sizes and different problems, plus we could have Git repositories containing several products at once, the flows could be different. The basic idea that you should master before looking for your first job and to say that you're a confident user of Git is to learn any convention of developing these differences. Basically, it looks like this. You have the most recent version of your software. It used to be called master branch, and it is renamed to be called main now. By the way, yes, I'm surprised that I see this name every day, but I don't remember it. So very likely it is main. And you create a branch, call the name of that will briefly describe what you're doing. And you create your changes in that branch. Then we call it push. That means you ask Git to make a copy of every change. Changes are called commits. Every change in GitHub, so it is available to your team members, or you could just see it if you are still learning the system and you don't really have a team. And there you could create what is called pull request or on GitHub or merge request in other version in other platforms of CloudGit. It is a request to merge the branch that you've created to another branch, usually the main branch, and the description and some comments of what you've done there. Plus, people, your peers or your senior team members could review your code and comment this difference, your code in this difference, line by line. That's how it works. The hard skill is to how to work with Git and how to work with GitHub, create a pull request. And the meta skill would be, or soft skill, that's a gray area, and that's all right. How to make your work of high quality is how to make your commit history, your changes history readable for other developers. There are lots of things to learn. For example, you could learn how to redo the existing history of commits, because when you solve the task, you could think as you go, and the names of your changes would be really draft. But when you have the complete solution, it could be easier for your colleagues to read changes related to every idea separately. So I often reset the changes and then add the parts of the final change that I created with different messages, explaining why this part of the change exists and then why another part of the change exists, and so on. Plus, apparently, how to write the good texts in your pull requests. That's another soft skill. And the last thing I want to mention for the beginner is that people usually learn Git by tutorials. And tutorials, most of the tutorials guide you through basics. So they say that Git is a command line tool and it has these commands that you have to write as a text and execute, and so on, so on, so on. And the problem that I see for this in the students who learn Git that way, the traditional way, that they don't understand what is the repository, the code storage, and they don't understand physical meaning of the branches because they have no mental model of what's happening. They know that they have, after every change, they have to type the command that will show them the changes, and then they have to type the commit command to name those changes. And that becomes a mechanical skill without understanding why you do that and what is the structure of everything of that. So when I hired the beginner developers who didn't know Git, I always provided them with a graphical interface for Git and asked them to use only this graphical interface. And that led for faster and easier understanding of what Git, what is the history of changes really is, because you see it visualized. You see the history, you see all the tree, all the branches. You also see the pointer where on that tree is your current files, the files that you could actually open and see their contents. So my advice, start learning Git with graphical interface. Don't start learning it from commands. You could learn the commands later.
It also sounds to me that the longer someone uses it and the more versions there are, the more it functions as a teacher because you have more history to reflect upon, and it might also give you clues as to solving current problems.
Uh, ye- yes and no, because people, my practice shows that we don't track too deep in the history of code. Theoretically, you could find there are some insights, but people are mostly focused on only on the recent changes.
Mm-hmm.
However, history still keeps very important information. For example, you found a bug that something is broken, and maybe it is broken not recently, it's just a rare feature, so no one noticed. Git supports some automation to easily find that change that broken this thing. If you see that it works before that change and it stopped working after that, then the history works for you. And of course, the very recent history is used very actively to understand what are we doing and where we are. And the longer history, yes, it could be a treasure, but in practice, people ignore it.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to just ask one curiosity, and then we'll move on to our fourth topic, which is when I look at some of my older writing, some of it's 5 years old, some of it's 10 years old, and I think it's terrible, and I'm embarrassed just because it's an indicator that I've grown and I've developed and I've flourished in my field as a writer. So have you had any experiences like that where you just happen looking on old code and you've realized that you've made some changes to your habits or your tactics, your strategy for writing code more recently?
I see people do that observation oh, often. I mean, many people do that, and I see them. In my case, it was more tolerant to the quality of code that I did in the past. Because when I find some artifact that I created in the past, I usually expect it to be of poorer quality than it actually is. So I'm usually more surprised because the expectations are very, very low. Uh, and I think for people who cannot tolerate their old code, is the expectations that are aligned with their current level. Plus, in when you work on text, it is often when you complete a text, the new text will be started from scratch. That's different with software because if it works, it starts evolving. So in 3 years, you see code written by you in the past, but it is still there because you were improving different parts of there. And some of the parts still keep your old code and your decisions. You could see the code by people who made it before you. You could see code by people with lower qualifications than yours. You could see code by people with higher qualification than yours that you cannot understand. So you think it is a bad code, but in fact, you just do not know why it is like that. So on a real project, you see this variety and it works as a single organism. That's paradox. Even if you write the whole code alone, at some point you could see that the behavior of the app, in particular some bugs, are unexplainable for you. So every part of the code is written by you consciously, intentionally, as an intelligent creator, as an intelligent design. But overall, it works as a product of evolution because it lives its own life because the parts work together in a new different ways. By the way, we have a meta skill of understanding emergent properties on our list, but not for today.
We'll be sure to get to it when the time comes. So number four, we have identifier names. I have it here as a soft skill, and just as I was going through it, it seems like okay. So between Markdown, code formatting, identifier names, that clarity and communication are critical to effective development. And so before we get into identifier names, or rather, as we're getting into it, I'm wondering how much resources, how much energy, how much of your week is used to go into the presentation and communication and clarity compared to the actual writing of the code.
It doesn't separate for separate hours because you do not present, or do you? As I mentioned, when you create a PR in every modern organization, it is mandatory. So your peers or some colleagues of different grade review what you did. It is mandatory. So you present it, but you always do that in a asynchronous way. So we never use the word present. Also, the presentation happens. But the review is only a tiny part. The main volume of presentation is when no one actually realizes that they estimate your code. Is the moment when they try to read your code and understand it to solve some particular problems they have. So, making the code clear, readable, and avoiding ambiguity is what you do continuously. And it might sometimes require some mental capacity that you're not willing to invest, because if you drafting the task that is very difficult for you to understand, you could ignore some details. That happens a lot, and that's fine. You just have to fix everything that you've drafted and that you made intentionally dirty before you deliver that code to your peer for the review. And we mentioned that indentation in code formatting could be misleading, but apparently the wrong name could be much more misleading. And if with indentation it is only a matter of simple training, because machines could do that. So if machines could do that, then you could simply train them. In naming identifiers is more complex thing, because no one have a clear system of how to do that. It is more arts. So trying to be a better colleague, trying to be the one who other appreciate to work with, you will have to think about these things and make your own conclusions. So I would like to enrich the field of understanding of those who begin learning this with some principles that are very common that you should consider, but these principles uh, are not the complete solution. They won't replace your understanding of what you do. And by the way, there is a famous saying that the two most complex problems in programming is naming a variable and knowing the moment to invalidate cache. What does it mean to invalidate cache? It's for senior developers, but naming the variables, it is what you face from the very beginning. First principle is to make the names of the variables descriptive. In math, in school, they teach us to use X, Y, Z, etc., single letter names. But in programming, it supports long names and various conventions to use multi-word names, although spaces are prohibited. But you could use case or underscores to do so. So you could describe what you do. That's the first principle. The second principle it is still fine to use single letter variables for the typical cases. So there are some cases like I for loops, n for the elements number. However, maybe it is better to call it size or length. Recently, I see people tend to use longer names, but the loop iterator is still single letter. Or R for result, for the result. Mimic to your code, to the style of your team mostly. There is no global standard on that except this I in the loop. And then, if you use several words, it is there is a trap of if you feel that it names what you want to say, this doesn't automatically mean the name is correct because we tend to use very generic expression. If you call a variable a value, that's reasonable. It contains value, so it feels that you did it right. But in fact, those who read this do not need this information because every variable holds a value. So this specific name doesn't add anything. You effectively had an anonymous variable. This name could be often met in the context where we have an algorithm that transforms a single value. Yes, the context says that it is obvious what we do. But in other cases, and in most cases, to have a good name and to, in your natural speech, to communicate an idea, you could more or less intuitively understand all the range of the ideas that could emerge here and express the difference between them. Why this variable is different to another variables that one could expect to meet here. And if you master this difference thinking, that's another meta skill I wanted to talk about, but again, not today, is thinking of contradictions. If you describe the contradiction, describe the opposite, you effectively communicate the information because the information, if you will attend the computer science course, they will teach you that the information is the measure of difference, or how it is called there, is the measure of reducing the uncertainty. So if you communicate something that is obvious for the listener, you do not reduce uncertainty, and thus you effectively do not communicate, do not provide them any information.
So, just briefly on the concept of contradictions, it my girlfriend, she's a professional actress. I'm an amateur actor, and for every 10 scripts that she auditions for, 9 of those scripts will say something contradictory, like, we need you to go broad but also restrained, we need you to be energetic but also calm. They always ask for both sides of it. And to me, I laugh when I help her with some of these, because I just see that, like, how do you can't, you're just asking for both. But what they're trying to do, and I'm steel manning them, by the way, is they're trying to find that sweet spot right in the center that you only receive and you only find if you've explored the two contradictory points.
Yeah, but that's a different aspect, and that's also very cool. If I will start a philosophical blog, I will write posts when I try to justify the opposites in the same text, because that's the way to perceive the complexity of our world. So that's the one thing. But why I say that this is different? Because when, for example, in my hobby language learn, often a word in the target language do not correspond any word in the languages that you already know. So in order to catch the meaning of that word, you need many words where it could be translated. And you shouldn't end on any of these words as a meaning that you understand. You should understand that the actual meaning is somewhere in between. And if you got that as a feeling, because you cannot get that as a word, this is the first time when you have a word for this, then you understood it. And that's exactly what you see in these requirements to show the opposites in the same time. That's the same when I want to justify the opposite statements in any text about the world, how our world works. But when we talk about the clear communication, we do the opposite. If you want to uh, tell someone what is an apple, then you're essentially separate apple of everything that is not an apple, and you create this distinction. If you want to tell someone what is a stock option, then you should better tell the difference with all the stock instrument that this person already know, plus the difference with some instruments that are similar to stock options, even if the person do not know they exist. And this difference is for clear communication, and it is we contrapose things, and that intention to be in the middle of something contradictive is a different thing. Is to it is intended to understand things that are not clear by their nature, that you cannot clearly describe in words, but you still need to understand.
And so we're closing down the hour, but we still got one more that we want to do today. So the last one, I have it as process matters, and I have it as soft skill. And as I was digging around for it, and I don't actually have a link for this one, I'll see if I can find one, is that it seemed like it was more of a principle and not necessarily a skill. But I think that there's always a balance of like every skill has principles to it, and every principle has to have some sort of tangible deployment, aka the skill. So yeah, so I guess you just help me out with this one. How is it a principle and how is it a skill?
Yeah, I missed that because I would correct this, that this is not a soft skill. This is a way to see things and to see your work, the way how you work. So this falls into a typical meta skill. Of course, considering that meta skill is not very broadly known term. So process matter states for process thinking. It addresses two problems. First problem, I saw that when people come to an organization that has a really nice processes defined. Business processes is a definition of the sequences of steps for you to react on particular situations or to operate with a particular artifact. For example, you have a text and your role is to do proofreading, put it to certain social networks, and do that for every text they provide to you. That's a business process. So the two important things to know and to embrace about processes is first, accept the processes of the company. People usually intuitively think of them as bureaucracy, and that's reasonable because they're often detached from the reality. So the perfect way of embracing them is to accept them, to follow them, and to raise problems when these processes do not help us solve our problems. You raise that to your manager, to your teammates, and you change the processes. But until you change them, you follow the process, because otherwise, how would you know it is wrong? And the important thing is that the good parts of the processes resonate with the Arabian proverb that the trail is smarter than the traveler. That part. So you should follow the processes because they help you create quality, but you should argue about the problems in this process. You should raise red flags that we are doing something wrong. And another part is to adopt this process thinking to your everyday chores because today most of us are overwhelmed with tasks, and software development is no exception. You work with lots of tiny things, but some of these tiny things you have to do repeatedly are similar to each other and they repeat in the same sequences. So if you define a process, a business process for yourself, personal, you could even share it with your organization if it works well. This process absorbs your experience that you had solving this problem, and the next time you will be overwhelmed and unable to come up with the same good solution. But if you have your process written, you could easily repeat it. Plus, if you do the same task again and again, uh, exactly in the same way, you acquire the mechanical habit of doing this type of the test, and it is very energetic, effective for you. So you no longer think about it, and you're able to think about the more important things that are different.
Is it ideal to create a process in advance? Is it ideal to create a process as you're working on it, or is it good to wait after a few, say, repetitions before you feel you're ready to create one?
That's a common mistake that many programmers especially do intuitively, is that you try to create a universal solution very first time when you face a problem. You create a very reusable code, and this code becomes very expensive to maintain and very difficult to understand. And the same could happen with processes. My recommendation is to do generalizations, do conclusions about how to reuse something only when you meet the same situation for the second or the third time. Only when you have at least two repetitions of the same, it's better more. You could understand what's really common and what's repeatable and what parts are different. And you won't waste your time and energy on planning everything, on creating processes or schemas for everything, because you could be overwhelmed with these schemas. But their
Mhm.
purpose is to protect you from being overwhelmed.
Okay. Okay. Well, fantastic. Well, Pavel, that was the 5 techniques that we've discussed for today. And if I had to create a broad theme for all of it, I think my takeaway, as respectfully as an outsider, is just how critical communication is, because what we're saying and what you're saying in the code isn't said once; it's said hundreds of thousands of times every time a user uses the feature that you've created. So it really just goes to show that I think that you're not just being a good developer; you have to be a good communicator as well.
Yeah, but this when we mentioned that communication is important, this always sounds concerning for me because that's again a very generic statement. So we are here, we've spent this hour to add more details to this very generic, but yes, I agree, it is to the very
That's why I
important
said like
statement.
it's a broad theme, right? So
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah,
generic by nature.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it is obvious for many people that it is important to communicate. But when you want to be successful in profession or simply improve your performance, improve your skills, you should dive deep into details and you should absorb these different examples and different detailed terms you have to do.
Before we wrap up, there was you reminded me of a story. This was earlier on when we were talking about clear communication and being truthful, and I just thought it'd be an interesting story just to tell to wrap this up. So this was a friend of mine, and she was just graduating from her program, and she needed her diploma to have the credential in order for her to apply to a job that she had a very good chance of getting. But the university, for whatever reason, it wasn't either the printer was broken or it wasn't getting her diploma to her. And so she's freaking out, and she's calling a bunch of people trying to understand what went wrong. And then a day later, it was all resolved. She gets the diploma, but now there's about 8 or 9 people who still think that she's in crisis. And she said she was really embarrassed and she didn't want to tell them this. And that's when I said, well, you have to tell them, because if you're not, you're lying to them, because they are currently living in a different reality than the one that you're currently in. So as much as it hurts in the short term, you do have to sort of maintain truth, because lying is not just like deliberate manipulative deceit. Sometimes it's also of evading the difficulty of being truthful with people.
Oh, one day we can dedicate a podcast talking about psychology, and in particular accepting things, communicating things, resolving problems, resolving in communication problems, etc. Yeah,
Yeah, I would look forward to having a discussion about that.
that's about it.
So yeah, if you have anything else that you wanted to share, this was the last chance to do it until our next episode. Otherwise, thank you again for your expertise and for putting this project together and having me involved.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks everyone who watched this. See you in the next episode.